It was the fall of 1998, and I was 23, itching to escape the noise of the city for a few days. I had rented a small hunting cabin deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. I had been here once as a teenager with my dad, who used to take me hunting, and the memory of the crisp, cold air and the smell of pine had stuck with me ever since. I hadn't been back in years, and now, on my own, I wanted the quiet, the solitude, the feeling of being completely alone with the woods. The drive out was long. Gravel roads wound through thick forests, their colors shifting to orange and brown, the last hints of green fading as winter approached. The air had a sharp bite to it, and every so often I caught the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow trail, hidden behind a curtain of spruce and fir trees. It wasn't much, a small wooden structure, probably built in the 1960s, with a stone chimney and a sagging roof. The paint was faded and peeling, and the boards creaked when I stepped onto the porch. But it had charm, a rustic honesty, and I felt a flicker of excitement as I carried my pack inside. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. I stacked firewood in the corner, swept the floor as best I could, and lit the small cast-iron stove. The room was tiny, maybe 15 feet square, with a low ceiling and one small window that framed a perfect view of the woods. I had packed a few supplies: canned food, jerky, a small bag of rice, and a few bottles of water, enough to last a long weekend. I unpacked my rifle, checked it carefully, and set it against the wall. Hunting was part of the plan, but more than that, I wanted to see the forest. I wanted to hear it. The first night was quiet, almost painfully so. The wind rustled the trees outside, carrying the faint calls of distant wildlife. I could hear the creek a few hundred yards away, water moving over rocks. Everything felt untouched, wild, and peaceful. I slept in a heavy coat, bundled against the cold, the fire dying down to embers. I remember waking once to the sound of branches snapping nearby, a sudden sharp noise that made my heart skip. But when I looked out the window, nothing was there. Probably a deer or maybe just a branch falling. I told myself that as I lay back down, the sounds of the forest settling around me. The next day, I ventured out into the woods. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees. I moved quietly, scanning for deer, but mostly just absorbing the forest. The smell of pine and damp earth was thick, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots was the only sound I made. Around midday, I saw the tracks, deep, wide, human-like, but not quite human. I froze. They weren't animal tracks. They were taller, longer, and something about their stride felt deliberate, like someone had been walking here recently and not on a hiking path. I followed them cautiously for a while, curiosity gnawing at me, but they led deeper into dense woods, where light barely reached the ground. Uneasy, I turned back toward the cabin. My imagination was running wild, but I kept telling myself that it had to be another hunter, or maybe some old logging tracks I hadn't seen before. That evening, I lit a fire in the stove, sat close to it, and tried to shake the tension. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the shadows in the cabin grew long and sharp. I could hear the wind outside, rattling the windows and whistling through gaps in the old wooden walls. And then I heard it. Faint at first, a rustling, almost like someone walking around the cabin outside. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Nothing, just black shapes of trees, the occasional flicker of movement in the underbrush. I sat back down, trying to convince myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next day, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. The tracks from yesterday were still there, faint in the mud near the creek. But now there were more, smaller ones, almost like someone had been walking barefoot, careful not to make noise. I followed them slowly, rifle ready. They led into a clearing I hadn't noticed before, just beyond a stand of pines. The ground was churned up, as if someone had been digging. There were marks, deep scratches in the bark of the trees, jagged and raw. My stomach turned. Whoever or whatever had been here, it wasn't casual. There was a presence, deliberate and unsettling. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound was amplified: the creak of the roof, the rattle of the stovepipe, the whisper of wind against the walls. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, careful, measured. I got my rifle and peered through the window, but the darkness was absolute. I could see shadows moving between the trees, too large to be deer, too deliberate to be the wind. Hours passed like this. At one point, I caught a glimpse of something crouched at the edge of the clearing. A figure, hunched, pale in the moonlight, and impossibly still. I couldn't tell if it was human. I couldn't tell if it was alive. I just knew it was watching me. I stayed put, heart hammering, waiting for the first light. When dawn finally broke, the figure was gone. I spent the morning checking traps I'd set for rabbits, trying to convince myself to leave the cabin and hike back to my car. But the woods seemed to close in around me. There was no trail except the one I had come in on, and the forest was thick. I knew I couldn't run blindly, so I stayed, moving carefully, keeping the rifle close. By the third night, I had started leaving makeshift alarms around the cabin. Small sticks balanced to fall if disturbed, bottles with rocks in them. Every time a sound came near, they would clatter. I slept lightly, fire roaring, and prayed the sun would rise without incident. The figure never came too close, never entered the cabin, but the tension was unbearable. My food dwindled, my firewood was low. Every noise felt like a countdown, every shadow a warning. On the fourth day, I made a plan to leave. I packed my remaining supplies at first light and stepped onto the porch. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so. I scanned the trees one last time and noticed the footprints again, fresh in the mud. But this time, they led away from the cabin, deeper into the woods, as if whatever had been here had been watching me prepare to leave. My heart was in my throat as I climbed into my old pickup, started the engine, and began the slow drive back down the trail. The woods pressed in around me, silent now, the only sound my tires crunching gravel. As I reached the main road, the tension eased, but the memory stayed with me. The cabin was small, unassuming, and yet it held a presence I couldn't explain. It wasn't ghosts, it wasn't stories, it was something real, human, or close enough that reminded me how thin the line is between solitude and being prey. I never went back to that part of the Bitterroots, and I never forgot the way the forest seemed to breathe, watch, and wait. Even years later, whenever I hear a snapping branch at night, I can feel the same pulse of fear, and I know that the woods are never as empty as they seem. I was 34 in the fall of 2019 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a small rented cabin deep in the northern woods of Montana. I had been working long hours that entire year, and my head felt heavy all the time, like I had been walking around with a helmet full of wet sand. I wanted silence, cold air, and the simple feeling of being far away from everything. The cabin listing made it look old, but solid, sitting in a clearing with tall pines rising around it like walls. It was cheap and available, which felt like a good sign at the time. I reached the cabin just before sunset on a Friday. The gravel road leading to it was cracked, uneven, and silent except for the sound of my tires crunching over loose stones. The air smelled like pine sap and cold dirt. The clearing around the cabin was wide enough for only one car, and behind it, the woods thickened again almost immediately. The cabin itself was made of dark wood that had turned gray in some spots from years of rain and snow. The porch steps sagged a little, and the door had scratches near the bottom, probably from old dogs or animals that used to wander around. Stepping inside, I immediately noticed how quiet it felt. No hum of electricity except for the tiny refrigerator. No traffic. No voices. Just the soft, ticking sound of the metal stove shifting as it adjusted to the temperature. The place had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a narrow couch. The smell inside was dry, like old books and cold air mixed together. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched through the windows, even though I knew it was just my mind reacting to the remote setting. Darkness came fast. The sun seemed to vanish behind the tree line in minutes, leaving the cabin in a heavy blue shadow. I made a simple dinner, ate in silence, and listened to the wind pushing through the trees. I kept the curtains open at first, but the blackness outside felt too thick, too close, so I eventually shut them. The first night passed without anything unusual, though I kept waking up. Every time I opened my eyes, the room looked slightly different, like the shadows had shifted while I slept. The wind changed pitch during the night, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, scraping against the wooden siding. Still nothing alarming, just normal cabin noises. The next morning, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and saw footprints in the thin layer of dirt near the tree line. They were small, like from a slim person, and they weren't mine. My prints were deeper, wider, and led to the car. These prints came from the woods and stopped near the side of the cabin. There were no animal claw marks, no odd shapes, just human footprints, barefoot ones. That detail hit me slowly, as if my brain wanted to deny it at first. The toes were clear, 5 marks, a full heel. Nos chutred. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to convince myself they were old. Maybe from someone who had stayed before me. Maybe the rain had washed away the edges and made them look fresh. But they seemed too crisp for that. Too sharp for footprints that had been stepped on days earlier. I told myself to ignore it and spent most of the afternoon inside, cleaning the place, rearranging things, trying to distract my mind. Every so often, though, I felt a faint pressure in the air, like something was standing close even though I couldn't see anything. I kept glancing at the windows without wanting to. By evening, the sky turned a dull gray and a light drizzle started. The air felt colder than it should have for early fall. I heated some soup and sat at the small wooden table. While eating, I kept hearing a faint crunch outside, like someone stepping on wet leaves. I tried to brush it off as branches falling, but the rhythm felt too steady. 2 steps, pause. 2 steps, pause. Slow, careful, like someone trying to move quietly. I stayed still for a long time, listening with every muscle in my body tensed. The crunching stopped after a while, and the silence afterward felt even heavier. I finished eating without appetite and checked every window. Nothing. Only darkness pressing against the glass. I went to bed early but couldn't fall asleep. I lay there staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to my heart thudding in my ears. At some point near midnight, I heard a soft scrape on the porch. Not an animal, not wind, something dragging lightly across the floorboards. Then a faint thump like weight shifting. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After several slow minutes, something brushed the door. A light, uneven sound, like fingertips tapping or brushing down the wood. The door latch held, and the sound stopped. I stared into the dark bedroom, frozen, feeling the fear settle deep inside me like cold water. Minutes stretched, and eventually the scraping faded. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake until the first thin line of daylight crept under the curtains. When I stepped outside that morning, my chest tightened. More footprints.
Bare footprints.
Smaller than mine. Lighter. They circled the cabin this time. They were fresh. The rain had stopped during the night, and the prints were sharp, untouched by water. Whoever made them came close to the bedroom window. I could see where the grass had bent under weight. I felt a slow, cold dread working its way through me. This wasn't someone lost. This wasn't someone passing through. Whoever it was had stood right by the cabin. They had circled it. They had been here in the night while I lay inside awake, listening. I decided not to stay another night. I packed fast, moving with stiff hands. Every few minutes, I checked the tree line, expecting someone to step out. Nothing moved, but the woods felt alert, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. When I opened my car door, I noticed something on the driver's side mirror. A faint smear, as if someone had touched it with dirty fingers. There were short, uneven marks, almost like someone with long nails had dragged them lightly across the glass. It wasn't deep enough to scratch, but the prints were visible through the smudge of dirt from the road. I didn't bother wiping it off. I got in, locked the doors, and started the car. Driving down that long gravel road, I kept checking the mirrors. The woods on both sides felt unnatural, too still, as if anything could step out at any moment. My hands were shaking on the wheel. Every bump and rock made the car jolt, and every time it did, my mind jumped to the image of a pale figure running behind me through the trees. It wasn't until I reached the main road, miles away, that my breathing finally eased. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. At a gas station, I stood outside the car for a long time, just letting normal sounds wash over me. Cars, voices, the dull hum of traffic lights. The world felt alive again. Later that evening, after checking into a motel, I checked the cabin listing online. It had been removed, not marked unavailable, completely gone, like it had never existed. I searched the owner's name through old emails, but nothing came up. No number, no profile.
No trace.
It was like the whole arrangement had been wiped. I never found out who left those footprints or why they came so close to me during those nights. But I do know they were real. I know someone walked barefoot around that cabin in the dark. I know someone brushed their hand across my door. And I know they stood outside my window long enough to bend the grass flat under their feet. I never went back to Montana after that. The memory stayed sharp, like a scar that never fully smooths out. Even now, years later, if the wind hits my house at night or I hear a soft scrape outside, my body goes cold the same way it did in that cabin. I keep blinds closed now. I lock my doors earlier in the evening. And sometimes, when I step outside early in the morning, I find myself checking the ground without thinking. Not because I expect footprints, but because I know what it feels like when they are there. I remember the heat first, the kind that presses on your skin until it almost feels like a weight. It was late July of 2014 when I went into the lower Amazon region of northern Brazil, somewhere between the far reaches of the Tapajós River and miles of untouched bush. I had taken a long break from my construction job in Manaus after a rough few months. A man named Paulo, a woodsman I knew distantly through my uncle, offered me his small cabin deep in the forest. He said it was simple and quiet, used mostly during the dry season when he worked felling trees for local buyers. He wasn't using it that year because he had hurt his hand. I didn't know him well, but I trusted him more than I trusted my urge to stay in the city. The cabin was a long way from everything. I reached the small riverside village first, then waited for a local who transported supplies by motorized canoe. After nearly 3 hours on the water, I stepped onto a muddy bank surrounded by towering trees. The cabin was still another hour's walk from there, but I didn't mind. I wanted the silence. I wanted the world closed around me. When I finally reached the clearing, the sun had already dipped behind the highest trees. The cabin stood small and square, built from rough, dark wood cut out of the forest decades ago. It had one room and a small lean-to that Paulo used for tools. The tin roof was rusted along the edges. The shutters were crooked. It smelled of old smoke, dried mud, and months of stillness. I liked it, felt undisturbed. For the first few days, I tried to settle into a rhythm. I spent mornings walking the narrow trails around the cabin, stepping over roots as thick as my arm and ducking under vines that felt like damp ropes. I felt the humidity settle on me like a second skin. In the afternoons, I sat near the edge of the clearing, cleaning my boots, sorting the gear I had brought, or just watching the sunlight flicker through the leaves like it was being sliced apart. At night, the forest came alive with insect sounds and distant animal calls that echoed strangely through the trees. It was chaotic, but somehow still comforting. Everything had its place, but on the fourth night, something changed. It began with small things. I noticed the latch on the shed door hanging open one morning, even though I was certain I had closed it the day before. A wooden crate inside the lean-to was shifted slightly to the side, dust disturbed under it. I blamed it on animals. Raccoons, small wild cats, anything that could have pushed its nose where it didn't belong. The next day, though, I found boot prints behind the cabin near the water barrel. Clear ones, narrow, long, deeper at the heel than the toe, like someone stepping carefully. They were not mine. My boots had a thick, square pattern on the soles. These didn't. These were smooth with only faint ridges. For a long moment, I just stood there staring at them. The forest around me felt different, the air heavier, the sun dimmer. I tried to convince myself the prints were old, left by Paolo earlier in the year, but they cut clean into the damp soil, sharp at the edges. They were recent. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep busy, but every sound felt louder than it should be. Cracks in the underbrush, sudden rustling high in the canopy. I kept turning around even when nothing was behind me. By the time the sky darkened again, my nerves felt stretched. That night, the stillness was wrong. Usually insects filled the air with a steady, chaotic hum. But around midnight, everything went quiet. I mean, completely quiet. So quiet I became aware of my own breathing. The kind of silence that feels like a warning. I lay still on the thin mattress, staring up into the dark, listening for something, anything, that explained the silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, hard to tell. The humidity made the air inside the cabin feel thick and warm. Then I heard it, a soft, slow step in the leaves outside the cabin. The weight of it was unmistakable, human. Not an animal hopping or slithering, not branches falling, a foot pressing down, lifting, pressing again. Someone was moving deliberately around the cabin. I felt my chest tighten. I had no weapon besides a small hatchet I kept near the door. I didn't move toward it. I didn't even sit up. I just lay there, eyes open, muscles locked, waiting. The steps circled the cabin slowly. Leaves crushed under the weight. A pause. Another step. Then silence again. I listened so hard my ears hurt, but nothing else came. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under like deep water. In the morning, I checked outside. More prints. Fresh ones circling the cabin in broad arcs. Fresh indentations near the tree line. My throat went dry. I didn't know whether to stay or leave, but the nearest village was hours away, and I wasn't sure who or what was watching me even then. The following night was worse. I tried to stay awake, sitting on the creaky wooden chair near the only window. My hatchet rested on my thigh. Sweat ran down my back even though I sat completely still. I kept listening to the endless buzz of insects outside, trying to lose myself in the normal sounds of the forest. Then, sometime after the moon rose, I heard bushes shift on the far side of the clearing. Not the light, aimless movement of an animal. Heavy, careful movement. I felt a cold rush of fear crawl up my spine. I leaned slightly toward the window without fully exposing myself, squinting into the darkness. The moonlight filtered through the thick trees, creating pale stripes across the clearing. Something was standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of a person, thin, tall, motionless. It stood perfectly still among the trees, almost blending into them, but just enough in view that I knew it was watching the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I don't know how long it stayed there. Could have been minutes. Could have been an hour. My eyes kept watering because I was staring so hard. Finally, slowly, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared completely. The jungle sounds carried on as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep. By sunrise, my mind was made up. I packed my bag with shaking hands. I didn't care if I left half my things behind. I just wanted to reach the river trail before whoever or whatever had been watching decided to get closer. As I stepped out of the cabin, I looked one last time toward the tree line. That's when I saw it near the dirt just past the clearing. A small piece of cloth caught on the rough bark of a tree. Dark, worn fabric, not from my clothes. And next to it on the ground, a crushed cigarette but still smelling faintly of smoke. I hadn't smoked since I was 20. No one else was supposed to be out there. The forest suddenly felt narrower, like every tree leaned in just a little more. My walk back to the river felt endless. Every sound made me turn my head. Every broken branch sounded like footsteps behind me. I never saw the man again, but I felt eyes on me the entire time, all the way until the river came into view, glinting through the foliage. When I finally reached the boatman's landing, the air felt lighter, almost safe again. The villagers didn't ask anything. Someone helped me into a canoe, and I didn't look back at the forest as the engine started. A week later, I heard from my uncle that Paolo had gone back to check on the cabin after I left. He found the shed door ripped open, footprints all around the clearing. He didn't stay the night. He didn't even step inside. He told my uncle that people sometimes move through those deep parts of the forest. People who don't want to be found, people who avoid towns and villages, people who watch before they act. He said the cabin wasn't safe to use anymore, not for anyone. He would likely tear it down the next time he went out there. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know who I saw standing there. I didn't want to know how long they had been watching. To this day, when I think back to those nights in that cabin, I can still feel that same heavy silence pressing down on the walls, the same slow footsteps circling the darkness outside, the same shadow standing completely still at the edge of the clearing. And I know one thing for certain. Someone was out there. Someone who knew I was alone. Someone who came close enough to touch the cabin walls in the night. I was lucky I left when I did. I don't think they wanted me to stay. I had been a park ranger in the dense forests of northern Montana for nearly 15 years, and I thought I had seen it all. Winters came early and stayed late. Rivers froze solid by November, and summer wildfires could turn a quiet meadow into a hellscape in a matter of hours. But nothing I'd encountered prepared me for the week in October of 2003, when 3 hikers went missing in the Sawtooth Range, and I found myself running through the forest under a cold, gray sky, chasing shadows that weren't supposed to exist. I remember that morning clearly. The leaves were at their peak, a riot of reds and golds. Yet the air had a wet, metallic tang, a prelude to the rain that was promised later in the day. I had been on my morning patrol when the radio crackled. Hiker parties were reported late at night. Some were overdue, but these 3, Amanda, Keith, and Sam, had left the trailhead 2 days prior and hadn't checked in. Their car was still parked neatly in the dirt lot, boots muddy from the trail, backpacks packed with supplies that now sat untouched. By mid-morning, my partner, Harris, and I had geared up. We packed extra food, climbing ropes, medical kits, and flashlights, and headed toward the cabin that had been abandoned for decades, but still stood along the North Creek Trail. The rangers often used it as a staging point during emergency searches. It was small, weathered, and half swallowed by pine and fir trees, but it provided a dry place for supplies. The hike in was slow. The forest floor was wet and slick with fallen leaves, and the sound of our boots was muffled by the thick undergrowth. Every now and then we'd pause, scanning the fogged treeline, our eyes straining to catch something out of place. Broken branches, a dropped piece of gear, footprints. There were plenty of deer tracks, the obvious signs of wildlife, but nothing that immediately suggested human passage. Still, the unease was growing. 2 days is not a long time, but the sawtooth's isolation can turn minutes into hours if someone isn't careful. We reached the cabin just as the clouds broke and a drizzle began. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting leaves. I remember running my hand over the cabin's door, its surface rough and splintered, nails protruding from the warped wood. We left our packs inside and set off toward the last coordinates reported by their GPS signal. My gut told me we were close to something, though I couldn't say what. The trail grew thinner, almost non-existent, as we moved deeper into the forest. Branches clawed at our jackets, and the rain became a constant drizzle, soaking us to the bone. I kept thinking about how quiet it was. Even in winter, there's always a distant howl of wolves or the rustle of small animals in the brush. But here, it was oppressive silence. Only the steady tap of rain on leaves and our boots on wet soil. After a few hours, we found the first clue. A hiker's glove, black with streaks of mud, half buried in a puddle. My stomach sank. It was small, unmistakably one of the three. I bagged it carefully. Harris's hands were trembling slightly, but he didn't say a word. From there, it was as if the forest itself was watching us. Footprints began to appear in the soft mud, 3 sets, all heading off the trail toward a denser part of the woods, toward a steep incline. They were erratic, zigzagging, almost like someone had been stumbling or running. We followed the tracks for what felt like hours, the fog thickening, wrapping the trees in a gray shroud. The wind picked up, whistling through the branches, and I kept my eyes glued to the ground, trying not to think of the possibilities. When the trail disappeared completely, we came across something that froze me in place. A backpack, torn, contents scattered, half sunken in mud, papers soaked through, a water bottle crushed, a raincoat ripped. The forest had claimed this part of the trail, hiding anything else from view. We decided to set up near the old creek, hoping to find more signs in the morning light. The cabin had a small fireplace and we got a fire going, but the smoke only mingled with the mist, and I felt the chill settle into my bones. I didn't sleep much that night. Every snapping twig sounded like someone approaching. Every shadow shifted with intention, though I knew it was just the trees and the wind. At first light, we resumed the search, this time with more determination. Harris and I spread out, moving carefully through the trees. It was then that I found it, the first body. Sam, half hidden behind a fallen log, his legs twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes open and blank. My stomach lurched. I crouched down, checked for a pulse, and confirmed the worst. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no obvious wounds. The terrain itself had done this. He must have slipped, fallen down a hidden ravine, and tumbled unseen into that shallow ditch. We pressed on. Keith was next. I found him caught between 2 rock outcroppings, lodged in a narrow crevice. His face was pale, and his arms were bruised from trying to climb out. It looked like he had fought the forest with every ounce of strength he had, but had succumbed to exhaustion. The rain had made everything slick, every rock a trap, every slope a hidden death. Amanda was the last. I found her hours later near a small waterfall, sitting in a shallow pool, soaked, shivering. She was alive, barely, but her legs were twisted in a way that suggested a fracture. She was coherent enough to nod weakly when I approached, eyes wide with fear and relief. I radioed Harris, and together we got her onto a makeshift stretcher, carrying her through the mud and over roots until we reached the cabin. By late afternoon, we had them all. Sam and Keith's bodies secured for transport back to town. Amanda wrapped in blankets, shaking but alive. The forest had been merciless, but at least we'd saved one life. I stayed up that night staring into the fire, listening to the rain drumming against the roof, replaying every step of the day. It wasn't some mythical horror that had taken them, just the forest itself. Deceptive, beautiful, and deadly. One moment you're following a trail, and the next the world falls away beneath you. The next morning we hiked out. Amanda was wrapped in a thermal blanket, silent but clinging to the warmth, while the bodies of Sam and Keith were carried on stretchers to awaiting rangers and vehicles. I remember the look on her face as she left the forest behind. Relief, terror, and grief all tangled together. For me, it was just another day on the job, but one that would haunt me for years. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was indifferent, and when people underestimated it, it demanded a price. By the time we drove back to the ranger station, the rain had stopped, leaving the leaves glistening with water, the air crisp and sharp. I cleaned my boots, checked the gear, and filed the report, but the images of that day, the twisted paths, the scattered belongings, the quiet, unblinking eyes of Sam, stayed with me. The forest hadn't played tricks. It hadn't haunted them. It had simply existed, and sometimes that's enough to change lives forever. Even years later, I would hike through the Sawtooth Range, listening to the rustle of leaves and the call of birds, remembering that October. Every snap of a twig, every mud-slick path brought a shiver to my spine. I had learned a simple truth. The forest doesn't need to be evil to be terrifying. It only needs to be real. I had been driving for hours along the winding back roads of northern Vermont. It was early October of 2013, and the maples and birches were flaring with bright orange and deep red, their leaves fluttering to the ground in the cold wind. I hadn't seen this part of the state before, and the deeper I went into the forested hills, the smaller and more unmarked the roads became. My car was kicking up a fine layer of dust as I passed abandoned farmhouses, old barns with sagging roofs, and stretches of road that seemed to vanish into nothingness. My stepsister, Claire, had passed away almost a year ago, and her husband, Derek, had insisted I come up to the cabin they had rented last summer to get some fresh air and clear my head. I hadn't been eager to come, but something about the isolation and Derek's insistence that the place might help me process everything had convinced me to make the trip. I finally turned onto a narrow gravel path that disappeared under a canopy of trees. The road was rough, and I had to slow down considerably, picking my way around potholes and exposed roots. The last half mile felt like a tunnel of shadow, the sunlight barely reaching the ground. When I arrived, the cabin emerged from the trees like it had grown there, a low, weathered log structure with a stone chimney and a small wooden porch. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of a crow cawing and the occasional creak of a tree swaying in the wind. I parked the car near the cabin and stepped out, stretching my legs. The gravel crunched under my boots, and I immediately noticed how quiet it was. There were no other cabins, no sounds of cars or people, just the distant rush of a stream somewhere down the slope. I grabbed my small duffel bag and made my way up to the front door, which had a simple metal latch. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. There was a living area with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. One of the bedrooms had a bed that still looked like it had been slept in recently, a faint imprint in the mattress, and an open book on the nightstand. I set my bag down and wandered through the cabin, feeling an odd mix of melancholy and unease. The place felt untouched, almost frozen in time, as though someone had left in a hurry and might return at any moment. I found a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the fireplace and decided I'd try to light it later, both for warmth and a sense of comfort. The windows looked out over a slope that fell into a dense forest, the canopy so thick that I could barely see the stream at the bottom. As the afternoon sun began to drop, I unpacked a few things and decided to explore the area around the cabin. The ground was uneven, scattered with roots and rocks, and the forest seemed endless. I followed a faint trail that descended toward the stream. The air was sharp and smelled of wet leaves. Birds flitted from branch to branch, but there was no sound of larger animals. No rustle in the underbrush, no scurrying of squirrels, nothing. It was as if the forest had paused, holding its breath. I reached the stream, a narrow ribbon of water tumbling over smooth stones. I knelt to fill my water bottle, listening to the faint roar as it passed over rocks. And that's when I noticed the first odd detail: the footprints. They weren't deer or bear prints. They were human, larger than mine, and they seemed to be pressed deep into the mud, leading away from the stream and disappearing into the thick trees. I froze. I had been careful during the drive here, and I hadn't seen anyone else. Derek hadn't mentioned other people staying nearby. I debated whether to follow them, but something in my gut told me to turn back. The sun was low now, and shadows were already pooling under the trees. I made my way back to the cabin as quickly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got inside, I bolted the door and sat down, trying to tell myself it was probably just someone hiking earlier in the day. But there was a persistent sense that I wasn't entirely alone. Night fell quickly in the forest. By the time I had stacked some firewood and lit a small fire in the fireplace, the moon was high, casting thin, silver light through the windows. I could see the faint outlines of trees swaying in the breeze, but everything else was swallowed in darkness. I sat in a chair near the fire, staring at the flames, trying to keep my thoughts from spinning. The footprints still nagged at me, and then I heard it, a faint scratching, almost a tap-tap-tap, coming from the side of the cabin. My stomach dropped. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but I could feel the hairs on my neck stand on end. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the noise, but there was nothing there, just the trees, swaying, indifferent. I forced myself to calm down and decided to check the perimeter of the cabin in the light of the fire. I went around the back, sweeping the flashlight over the walls and the surrounding clearing. There were no signs of anyone hiding, no footprints leading to the cabin itself, just the faint path I had walked earlier. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I double-checked the doors and windows and made sure they were locked. Every small sound, the creak of a log settling, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I ended up sitting on the floor near the fireplace, huddled in a blanket, until the fire burned low and the room was dim. I tried to sleep, but every shadow seemed alive. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something moving just outside the cabin. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the building. My pulse shot up. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought along and crept to the window, peering through the curtains. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. No one there. But then I noticed the faint impression of footprints in the soft earth around the cabin, deeper than any normal weight should make. Someone had been walking around, watching. I realized that these weren't just random intruders. This was someone who knew how to move quietly, who had been patient, and they hadn't left yet. Dawn came slowly, painting the forest in muted gold and gray. Exhausted but alert, I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I packed my bag quickly, leaving behind the few things I had tried to make myself comfortable with, and stepped outside. The forest was quiet now, almost peaceful, but my eyes immediately caught the footprints leading away from the cabin. They went off into the deeper woods, toward a part of the slope I hadn't explored. I followed them cautiously, heart racing, until I reached a small clearing. There, partially hidden by fallen leaves and branches, was a small campfire site, cold and long unused, but with signs that someone had been there recently. Empty food wrappers, a rusted can, a makeshift lean-to barely visible under the brush. It was clear that someone had been living in the woods near the cabin. Someone who might have been watching me all along. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I retraced my steps to the cabin, got in my car, and started the long drive back down the winding roads, constantly checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone, but the memory of those footprints, circling the cabin, stayed with me. When I finally reached the main highway, sunlight spilling across the asphalt, I allowed myself to breathe. I reported the cabin to local authorities later, explaining the evidence I found. They assured me that it was likely someone squatting in the woods. Dangerous, yes, but not supernatural. The cabin was boarded up, and patrols were increased, but I never went back. The forest kept its secrets, but I never doubted what I had experienced. That night, the isolation and the quiet had almost cost me my peace, and the knowledge that someone had been silently observing me left a weight I could still feel years later. It was late October of 1997 when I decided to spend a few nights alone in a cabin up in the mountains of western Montana. I was 34, freshly retired from the city police force, and desperate to escape the hum of traffic, the endless phone calls, and the constant feeling of being watched in my own apartment. The cabin itself wasn't new. It was the kind of place that had been built in the 1960s, with dark-stained pine walls, a sagging roof, and a wood stove that hadn't been serviced in years, but it was mine for the week. I drove up in my old Ford pickup, loaded with firewood, canned goods, a rifle, and enough blankets to smother a small army. The rain had started just as I turned off the main highway, and by the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, the storm was coming down in sheets. The last mile of the drive was almost impossible. The road was slick mud, with deep ruts from previous travelers, and my tires spun more than they gripped. I had to stop 3 times to assess whether it was safer to back up or push forward. Every time lightning struck in the distance, it illuminated the dense forest around me, and I swear I could see shadows moving just beyond the trees, though I knew it was likely the wind bending the branches. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, I was soaked through, my boots caked with mud, and my nerves on edge. The cabin looked almost pitiful in the rain, smoke curling faintly from the chimney like a sigh of relief. I stepped out, feeling the cold slap of the wind and the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke. I dropped my pack by the door, pulled out a flashlight, and began unpacking. The cabin was small. One main room with a loft above that served as the sleeping area, and a tiny kitchen with a rusted sink and a grimy stove. The windows rattled in their frames with each gust of wind, and the door made a hollow, echoing sound when I shut it. I lit a fire in the wood stove, the flames flickering weakly against the dark walls, and felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The rain hit harder now, hammering the roof with a relentless rhythm that made it difficult to hear anything else. Around 10 in the evening, after a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, I sat near the fire with a mug of coffee, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls. That's when I first noticed it. A noise outside, soft and deliberate, like someone or something, was moving around the perimeter of the cabin. At first, I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too intentional. A stick snapping here, a heavy thump there, the crunch of wet leaves under something's weight. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, but the rain blurred the beam and soaked everything in shadow. Nothing, only the forest, dark and unyielding. I returned to the fire, telling myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But the noises didn't stop. They got closer, circling the cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. At one point, I could swear I heard the scrape of boots on wet earth. My stomach tightened. I had grown up around hunters and trackers. I knew what it sounded like when someone or something was waiting, listening. I checked the locks on the door, even though they were cheap and old. The rain was relentless, the wind picking up so that it whistled through every crack in the walls. I sat down again, back pressed against the wall, listening. The sounds outside slowed, paused, then started again, moving in small, careful circles. My rifle was propped against the wall, a steady presence I could cling to. Hours passed like this. I stayed awake, listening, scanning through the windows with my flashlight. At some point, exhaustion hit me, but the fear made it impossible to sleep. I dozed in short bursts, jerking awake at every snap of a branch. And then, sometime after midnight, the worst happened. I heard a knock on the cabin door, solid, deliberate, and loud enough to make me jump. My first instinct was to run, but I was trapped. The door was the only exit. I grabbed the rifle and pressed myself against the wall beside it, breathing shallow. Another knock, then silence, then scratching, like someone was dragging something across the wooden planks. My mind raced. Who would be out here in this weather? I couldn't see anyone from the window. I couldn't see their face if they were right there. I tried calling out, but my voice caught in my throat. The rain was too loud for me to be heard beyond the cabin. I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for this person to decide whether I lived or died. I grabbed my flashlight, aimed it at the door, and swung it open. The wind and rain hit me like a wall. Mud squelched under my boots. And there he was, or at least a man drenched, soaked through to the bone, face pale and dripping. He froze in place when he saw me, eyes wide. He didn't move or speak, just stood there. I swung the door wider, shined my light full on him, and felt my fear shift to cautious assessment. He was not a threat, not really, not in the sense I had feared. He was shivering violently, soaking wet, and clearly exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from hiking for hours in a storm, lost and desperate. His jacket was torn, shoes ruined by mud. He looked more scared of me than I was of him. I stepped back, keeping the rifle trained but lowering it slightly. He said something, but the rain drowned it out. I motioned for him to come in. He hesitated for a second, then took a step, mud sliding off his boots, dripping onto my floor. I closed the door behind him, bolted it, and immediately grabbed a towel from the kitchen. He was shivering uncontrollably. I helped him dry off as best I could, moving slowly, watching him closely. He was pale, lips blue, teeth chattering, soaked to the skin, and completely silent. By the time the fire was roaring again, he had collapsed on the floor near it, curling up like a child. I got him some dry clothes I had brought for myself, and he changed quickly, still barely speaking. I realized he must have gotten lost somewhere in the mountains, stuck out in the rain without shelter. The storm had driven him straight to my cabin. We didn't talk much. There was no need. I checked the rifle and the locks, then made sure he was warm enough. Over the next hour, the storm finally began to ease, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. I watched him fall asleep near the fire, exhausted but alive. I felt a strange relief, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all evening drain out of me. The fear had been real, yes, but it had been a fear rooted in the unknown, not in danger from another human being. By morning, the sun was peeking through the clouds. The forest around the cabin was drenched, the mud thick, but the air smelled fresh and alive. He was gone when I woke, leaving a note thanking me and promising to report the cabin as private if anyone asked. I never saw him again, but the experience stayed with me. That night, I realized the mountains, the storm, and the isolation could make you imagine all sorts of horrors. But sometimes, the fear is a lesson, teaching you that preparation, caution, and humanity are what matter. I stayed the rest of the week in the cabin, alone but not lonely, the rain having finally stopped. I built stronger locks, cleared the perimeter, and even marked a path to the road more clearly. When I left, I felt a quiet pride, surviving the storm, surviving the fear, and proving to myself that even in the darkest, most terrifying night, clarity, calm, and care could get you through. I was 31 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a rented cabin deep in the northern Idaho woods. It was early October 2019, the part of the year when the days were still warm but the nights already carried the weight of winter. I had been burnt out from work, tired of the noise of the city, and convinced myself that a quiet cabin near a small lake would clear my head. I had no real plans other than hiking, cooking simple food, and trying to sleep better. I drove there on a Thursday morning, taking a rough forest road that twisted through miles of pine trees until the signal on my phone disappeared completely. The cabin was smaller than I expected, only one floor with dark wood walls and a green tin roof that had rust creeping around the edges. A narrow porch wrapped around the front. There were no neighbors, only trees so thick that I couldn't see more than 30 yards in any direction. The lake was behind the cabin, about a 5-minute walk, hidden behind tall grass and dead logs. The place felt old but not abandoned, like people used it but never stayed long. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the warm sunlight slipping between the trees. Inside the cabin, everything smelled faintly of pine and dust. The kitchen had a tiny stove, a small sink, metal pans that looked decades old. The bedroom had a single bed, the mattress thin and uneven. A wood stove stood in the corner of the living room with a stack of chopped logs beside it. I checked every window latch, not for safety, but just to get familiar with everything. I liked knowing how a place was put together. The first day passed quietly. I walked around the lake and took pictures of the reflection of the mountains in the water. The wind barely moved, and the air felt clean in a way I hadn't experienced in years. When night came, it dropped fast and sharp. I built a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the porch watching nothing but darkness between the trees. The silence was so deep it felt like a weight on my chest. In the city, silence never existed. Out here, silence was the default state. I went to sleep early, tired from the long drive. The cabin walls creaked every few minutes, the way old wood often does when it adjusts to the cold. I didn't think much of it. I slept lightly, waking up several times from small noises, but every time I told myself the same thing, that old cabins move, the wind shifts branches, and small animals wander through the woods at night. On the second day, I found tracks behind the cabin near the lake. They weren't bear tracks. The shape was too slender. They looked like boot prints, but the edges were worn as if the person had walked there a long time ago. Still, they were fresh enough to keep their shape in the soft dirt. I checked the listing again later, remembering the owner had said no one else lived nearby. I told myself hikers sometimes wandered off trails. That explanation worked well enough in the daylight. I spent most of that day gathering fallen branches to keep the cabin warm at night. I walked farther into the woods than I planned, exploring small clearings and patches of moss-covered boulders. Something about the forest felt older than it looked, like the trees hid more than they showed. Every so often I smelled something that reminded me of metal, sharp and cold, but it faded before I could pinpoint where it came from. That night, I fell asleep to the crackle of the wood stove. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint thud outside the cabin. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. The sound didn't repeat, so I lay still, listening. After a few minutes, all I heard was the wind brushing against the roof. I calmed myself, convinced something had fallen from a tree. I forced my eyes shut and made myself stay in the bed until morning. On the third day, I noticed something new. The boot prints near the lake were deeper than before, as if someone heavier had stepped exactly in the same place. I also found one print closer to the cabin porch. The dirt there was thin and dry, but I could still see the outline. I checked the whole area, walking slow, scanning every patch of ground. The prints led nowhere. They started and ended like someone walked right up to the cabin and then vanished. My skin prickled with unease, but I didn't want to accept that anything was wrong. I told myself again that hikers wander, hunters explore, people get curious. I swept the porch, cleaned the kitchen, and tried to keep my mind busy. But every time I went outside, I felt watched. Not by something supernatural. It felt like the kind of watching that comes from someone hiding behind a tree just far enough away to stay unseen. That night, I kept the stove burning hotter than before. I wanted the warmth to push back the cold that had settled into my bones. I tried to sleep, but the darkness pressed too close. I lay awake for hours, staring at the faint outline of the window. The glass reflected nothing. It was just a black square. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I heard slow, heavy footsteps in the dirt outside the cabin. They moved with steady rhythm, not the random shifting of an animal. My body froze. The footsteps circled the cabin, one side at a time, like whoever was out there wanted to check every window. The wood floor felt cold under my feet as I sat up in the bed, breathing through my nose to stay quiet. I counted each step as it scraped the dirt. When the footsteps reached the back wall, near the bedroom, they paused for a long moment. I could hear the faint sound of breathing through the wooden boards. Slow, steady, controlled. It wasn't the breathing of someone running or scared. It was the breathing of someone who had all the time in the world. My mouth went dry, and my hands shook so hard I had to press them into the blankets. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Finally, the footsteps drifted away, fading into the woods behind the cabin. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting up in bed with my back against the wall, eyes locked on the window. When morning finally came, the sun felt weaker than before. I walked outside, forcing myself to look around. The footsteps were there, clear as if someone had walked through wet cement. They circled the entire cabin. They were fresh, they were deep, and they were the same exact size as the other prints near the lake. I knew then that someone had been watching the cabin long before I arrived. I decided I wouldn't spend another night there. I packed fast, stuffing clothes and tools into my bag without folding them. The silence around the cabin felt wrong now, like it wasn't silence but holding its breath. I loaded the truck and double-checked the back seat. As I went to lock the cabin door for the last time, I noticed something on the porch wood. Small shavings, like soft curls of wood scratched from the surface. I crouched and looked closer. They lined up in a neat pattern near the doorframe. They were the height of someone's fingertips. Someone had been standing there, dragging their hand slowly up and down the wood. My stomach twisted. I backed away from the door and got into the truck. The forest road felt longer than before. Every bend looked like a place where someone could stand and watch the vehicle pass. When I turned onto the main gravel road, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for hours. I didn't stop until I reached the small town where I'd fueled up days earlier. Only then did I check the back of the truck again, convinced someone might have climbed in. But it was empty. The cabin owner emailed me a week later asking how the stay went. I didn't answer. I didn't leave a review. I didn't want to think about it anymore. Months passed before I could sleep through a full night. Sometimes even now, when I wake up in the dark, I remember the breathing at the wall, the slow, patient rhythm, the steady footsteps circling the cabin like a practiced routine. I know what I heard. I know what I saw in the dirt. and I know I left just in time. The memory stays with me not because something supernatural happened, but because it didn't. It was real. It was human. And knowing that someone had been watching me, studying me, moving around that cabin with calm footsteps and steady breath, knowing how close they came, still makes my skin crawl. I never went back to any remote cabin again, and I never will, because the worst thing out there in the woods wasn't an animal or a ghost or some strange creature. The worst thing was a person who never spoke a word, a person who knew how to move in the dark, a person I never saw but who saw me, and who walked around that little cabin every night before I even realized I wasn't alone. I retired from the force 3 years ago at 58, and I thought I'd traded the chaos of the city for the quiet of the North Carolina backwoods. I bought a small, isolated cabin up near the foothills, the kind you drive past and think it's abandoned because it's set back so far from the main road. The year was 2017 when I moved in, carrying more years of hardened instinct than actual furniture. I thought the woods would calm me, let me breathe without the constant hum of sirens and the press of people. I was wrong, though. I just didn't realize the kind of tension that can hide in silence. The cabin itself was modest. One story, pine walls darkened by time, a stone fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in months. I had a small porch with a few rickety chairs, and behind it, the forest sprawled like a green ocean. Most of the time I spent hiking or chopping wood, keeping the place maintained. I liked routine. It reminded me of police work in a way, predictable in its patterns. But one late September evening, I learned just how unpredictable quiet could be. It was around 7 when I noticed it. Footprints in the dirt leading toward my cabin. Heavy, irregular, like whoever or whatever made them wasn't used to moving carefully through the underbrush. I paused, squinting through the dying light. My first thought was someone hunting without permission, or maybe a kid wandering off a nearby trail. I checked the caliber of my rifle and loaded it, moving quietly to the window. There was nothing visible yet the prints were fresh. The kind of fresh that tells you someone was there minutes ago, maybe even watching. I spent that night in the cabin alert, windows locked, gun in reach. I watched the trees sway, imagining 1,000 possibilities, each more likely than any ghost story. It was only nature, or so I told myself. By morning, the prints were gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Days passed. I settled into the routine, chopping wood, reading old case files just to keep my mind occupied. But then it happened again, only closer this time. I was sitting at the porch with my coffee, the smell of pine and damp earth sharp in my nose, when I noticed a movement behind the trees. Something, or someone, was crouched just out of the clearing, looking toward me. I froze, remembering my years on the force. People rarely run into the same spot twice unless they intend something. I grabbed my binoculars, careful not to make noise, and focused. A man, maybe in his 40s, dressed in dark layers, camouflaged poorly against the browns and greens of the forest floor. He wasn't carrying a gun, not obviously, but the way he crouched and watched was deliberate, calculated. My stomach sank because I recognized that posture. Years of tailing suspects flashed in my memory. This was not someone lost. I stayed still for a long while, letting him think I wasn't there. Eventually, he moved again, deeper into the woods, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. I couldn't call the sheriff, too far out, no reliable signal. I didn't have anyone else nearby, and calling 911 might be meaningless if he disappeared before help arrived. My mind went through options, strategies, every single protocol I drilled on patrol. I decided to prepare, quietly fortifying the cabin, making sure every lock worked, doors reinforced, windows blocked as best I could without drawing attention. The next night, around 10, I heard it. footsteps crunching over the gravel path leading to the cabin. Slow, deliberate, I moved into the shadows, rifle in hand, ears straining. The front door rattled lightly. Someone had tested it. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to breathe steady, remembering every moment of training. Whoever this was had no idea I was ready. The man didn't rush. He never did. He moved like he was confident, like he had all the time in the world. I waited until he was halfway up the porch, just about to reach for the handle, and then I stepped out, aiming the rifle. "Stop right there," I said, voice calm but firm. The man froze, and for a moment, the night held its breath. Then he ran, fast, through the woods, breaking branches in his escape. I didn't chase him. Not yet. That wasn't instinct, it was patience. I spent the next hour checking all around the cabin, making sure he hadn't left tools, weapons, anything. Nothing. He had left no trace. Only his boldness remained in my mind, and it stayed with me. The following week, I took action. I rigged motion-activated lights, hung a couple of cameras at the perimeter, and made sure every approach to the cabin was visible on the screen in real time. I also made sure my rifle and a few handguns were within reach at all times. I stopped wandering in the woods alone, stayed close to the cabin. Every sound became meaningful: branches breaking, wind moving leaves, deer stepping on dry twigs. Each could be the man again coming back. 2 weeks later, I caught him. The lights on the cameras showed him moving through the forest, circling, watching, just like before. I called the sheriff this time, gave them coordinates and descriptions. They didn't move quickly, they had jurisdiction limits, but I didn't care. I had what I needed. That night, I waited with the rifle trained on the path. At around 11, he appeared, slow, careful, thinking he could scare or intimidate me. But this time, I had backup. Sheriff's deputies arrived quietly, flanking him without making a sound. He was caught without a struggle, just as calculated as before, but unprepared for numbers. When they led him away, I finally allowed myself to feel relief, a deep, steady kind I hadn't felt in years. The cabin didn't feel quite so haunted anymore. The tension lifted, replaced by a sense of regained control. I never saw him again after that, and I made sure the cabin stayed fortified. I also made a habit of checking in with the sheriff regularly, letting them know of any unusual activity. The woods remained quiet after that, not because it was peaceful, but because I had asserted boundaries, proven that I wasn't a soft target. Living alone in the cabin taught me something crucial. Fear doesn't come from ghosts or fairy tales. It comes from the real world, people, circumstances, chance encounters. And sometimes, the scariest moments are the ones that require no imagination at all, just vigilance, patience, and the ability to act decisively. The forest never felt threatening again, not because it changed, but because I had changed. I had faced it, faced him, and I had survived. I could walk the paths at dawn with my coffee and not feel eyes on me. The birds sang again, the wind whispered through the pines, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of peace I had chased when I left the city behind. I still carry my service weapon and keep a watchful eye, but the fear is no longer the same. It's measured, managed, and most importantly, real. It's a reminder of the life I led, the instincts I honed, and the quiet knowledge that some threats can't be imagined. They must simply be met head-on with calm and clarity. And in that clarity, the cabin became more than a shelter. It became a home, a testament to survival and vigilance, and a place where fear no longer rules. I had never planned to walk through the old graveyard that night, but the shortcut saved almost 20 minutes, and the sky was already turning a heavy dark blue that looked colder than the air itself. It was late October of 2019, and I had been driving back from a small job out in the hills of northern Wyoming. My phone had lost signal hours earlier, the GPS froze, and I ended up taking the wrong turn somewhere past an abandoned fuel station. The narrow dirt road seemed to lead nowhere, so I parked near a rusted gate and decided to cut across the field to find the main road faster. The field didn't look like anything special at first, just weeds and scattered rocks. But as I walked deeper, the shapes of uneven stones began to rise from the ground. Some were leaning, some cracked, some barely sticking out from the dry soil. It took me a few seconds to realize they were old grave markers, the kind that didn't have metal plates or carved names, just crude stones from the early settlers. The place looked forgotten, the type of land people drove past and assumed was just more empty wilderness. I kept walking, and the wind slowly died down, leaving the entire area strangely quiet. It felt as if the ground itself was absorbing every sound I made. I remember the air being colder near the stones, almost like I had stepped a few feet lower into a dip I hadn't noticed. My boots sank slightly into the earth, the dirt softer and darker than the dry grass behind me. I saw the cabin just beyond the graveyard, sitting low and crooked next to a line of bare trees. The structure looked like it had been built long before the stones were placed here. The roof sagged in the middle, the boards were gray and peeling, and one window was blocked by a sheet of metal nailed across it. I didn't have any interest in exploring it, but the cabin stood right between me and the direction I needed to go. As I got closer, I noticed small things that made me slow down. A heavy chain hung loose on the cabin door, like someone had once locked it from the outside, not the inside. The porch was slightly sunken on one side, and the wood had deep scratch marks near the edges. Not like animal scratches, longer, straighter, spaced unevenly as if someone had dragged something sharp along the boards without much strength. I walked around the cabin instead of passing in front of the door. The ground there was colder too, almost moist under the fallen leaves. It smelled faintly of soil and something metallic, something old. I kept my eyes straight ahead, but in my side vision I noticed metal stakes hammered into the dirt near the back wall. 3 of them, thick, rusted, and bent toward the cabin like something had pulled on them for years. I didn't stop to examine them. Something in my chest felt tense, like my heart was choosing to stay quiet so I wouldn't hear how fast it was beating. The cabin had a second window on the backside, the glass dusty from the inside. I tried not to look through it, but human curiosity always works against good sense. I didn't see anything at first, just darkness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw the outline of a table pushed into the corner. Not a normal table, but an old wooden one covered in stains that looked too dark to be from water or age. There were tools scattered on it, the kind used for hunting or trapping. Long metal hooks, a thick saw with teeth missing, and lengths of rope that looked stiff from being left in one position too long. My breath felt tight in my chest. The ground under the window had deep footprints in it too, human footprints, but old, warped by time and weather. I couldn't tell if they were made by one person or many, but they circled the cabin like someone had walked laps around it over and over. I moved on quickly, focusing on the field ahead of me. The fastest way out was to cross the far fence and follow the open plains back toward the nearest county road. I kept walking, trying to keep my mind blank, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier with every step. I didn't hear anything behind me. No twigs snapping, no footsteps, but the silence itself felt unnatural. The moment I reached the edge of the graveyard, the wind suddenly picked up again. It came from behind me, blowing from the direction of the cabin. Cold, sharp, carrying the smell of damp wood and something faintly rotten. I didn't want to turn around. My body felt like it understood something long before my mind did. Still, I turned. The cabin door, the one held shut by the loose chain, was slightly open, just enough to show a few inches of darkness beyond the frame. I didn't see anyone. No movement, no shape, nothing. But I knew the door had been closed earlier. I remembered the chain resting in place. The wind pushed the door another inch open, and then it stopped. No creaking, no slamming, just that one slow movement. My legs felt heavy as I forced myself to walk faster. I crossed the far fence, climbed over it with stiff hands, and walked in a straight line through the open field without looking back again. The sky turned black, and the only light came from the faint reflection of the moon behind the clouds. I kept walking until the ground turned rocky and dry again, far from the soft soil near the graves. I eventually found the dirt road, the same one I had abandoned earlier. My truck sat exactly where I left it, looking smaller than I remembered. My keys were cold in my hands, colder than they should have been from just being in my pocket. When I started the engine, the headlights hit the field behind me. The graveyard was barely visible, just dark bumps on the ground. But the cabin stood clear in the distance, the front door still open. For a second, I thought I saw something leaning in the doorway, just a shape, the shape of a person standing very still. But as soon as the thought formed, the headlights shook slightly on the uneven road, and the doorway looked empty again. I put the truck in drive and left without stopping once, not even to adjust the radio or try my phone again. The road felt longer on the way out, and the sky seemed even darker, like the whole area was sinking behind me. When I eventually reached the main highway, only then did my breath return to normal, and the cold feeling in my hands faded. In the weeks after that night, I tried to look up the land on old maps. I wanted to understand what that cabin was or who built it, and why there were grave markers scattered all around it with no names. I found almost nothing, just a mention of a tiny settlement from the 1870s that vanished after a harsh winter. No survivor lists, no records, no details. Just a line in an old archive saying the area was abandoned after several disappearances. I didn't need more information after that. I didn't want it. I didn't want to know whose tools were on the table or why the stakes were bent toward the cabin. I didn't want to know why the ground was softer there, or who had walked circles around it for so many years. All I know is that the place still exists out there somewhere, hidden in the plains of Wyoming, sinking deeper into the earth year by year. And the cabin door, the one that opened by itself, is probably still hanging crooked, waiting for another person to take the wrong turn and try to cross the wrong field at the wrong time. I never went back. I never even drove near that part of the state again, because the silence in that graveyard didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like someone listening. And that was enough for me to understand that whatever happened there, and whoever lived in that cabin long before I arrived, left something behind that still hasn't moved on. Not in a supernatural way, but in the real, unsettling way that comes from people who did terrible things in a place no one ever watched. The ending was clear to me the moment I saw that door open on its own. Whatever had happened inside that cabin wasn't finished, and I was lucky enough to leave before I became another forgotten stone in that field. I remember the summer of 1998 like it was yesterday, even though it has been almost 27 years. I was 19, freshly out of my last year in high school, and I had convinced myself that a few weeks working at my uncle's old farm in northern Missouri would be a great escape from the city. The farm wasn't far from the main road, but the gravel track leading to it was barely maintained, twisting between overgrown cornfields and thick patches of woods. By the time I reached the cabin that first evening, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the land. The cabin itself wasn't much. A weathered, two-room wooden structure with a sagging porch and peeling paint. I had stayed in similar places before, but there was something about this one that felt off. The boards creaked under every step, and the windows were dirty, yellowed with years of neglect. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and the faint smell of old wood mixed with the sharp tang of rust from the metal stove in the corner. My uncle, a wiry man with a permanent tan from years in the sun, told me I could sleep there, though he warned me to be careful around the barn at night. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first couple of days were nothing special, mornings spent fixing fences, afternoons tending to the chickens and cows. The rhythm of the farm was oddly soothing, but there were little things that made me uneasy. Tools I had left in one place would be in another, sometimes slightly out of order. Footsteps seemed to echo in the barn when I was alone, though I had checked every corner. I chalked it up to the old building settling, or my imagination running wild in the silence of the fields. Then came the night of the storm. I had been in the cabin, reading by the dim light of a lantern when the first distant rumbles of thunder shook the windows. The sky turned a strange, bruised purple, and wind started to whip through the trees, making the loose boards of the porch groan. I remember gripping the sides of the table, feeling my stomach tighten. There was a strange, almost metallic scent in the air, mixed with the wetness of the soil after the first drops of rain hit the ground. Around midnight, the wind intensified. The rain became a torrential downpour, hammering the roof and sides of the cabin. That's when I first noticed it. Faint, dragging sounds coming from outside. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the cabin wall, but the rhythm was deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving across the muddy ground, carefully avoiding the puddles. My heart started to race, and I forced myself to stay calm. After all, it was a farm, and animals sometimes wandered close to the cabin during storms. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A soft thud, then a scraping, like heavy boots being dragged across the wet grass. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the rain. My uncle had told me to lock the cabin doors at night, but I hadn't bothered. The thought now made my stomach twist. I moved slowly to the door, trying not to make a sound, and peeked through the dirty window. The yard was empty. The storm reduced visibility to almost nothing, the rain cutting everything into blurry shadows. But then I saw it. A silhouette at the edge of the barn, tall, hunched, and completely still. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out details, but I could see the figure shifting slightly, like it was watching me. My first instinct was to call out, but my voice stuck in my throat. Every hair on my arms and neck stood on end. I retreated to the corner of the cabin and grabbed the old hunting rifle my uncle kept in the corner. My hands shook as I loaded it, each click of the cartridges sounding deafening in the tiny room. I told myself to stay rational. Maybe it was a trespasser or someone looking for shelter from the storm. I had to wait. I couldn't make a move until I knew more. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell, the storm outside never letting up. Every so often, I would see the figure shift, always near the barn, always just out of reach of the lantern's light. I didn't sleep, couldn't. My mind spun with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Eventually, the storm began to die down, the rain thinning to a constant drizzle. I waited another hour before I finally dared to open the door and step outside. The ground was a sticky, treacherous mess of mud. The barn doors hung slightly open, swinging slowly from the wind. I stepped closer, rifle raised, trying to peer inside. That's when I saw it. A trail of footprints, large and heavy, leading from the woods to the barn and circling around the back of the cabin. Some of the footprints were barefoot, some were shod, and they weren't fresh. They were older, filled with rainwater, but still clearly defined. I followed them, heart pounding, until they disappeared into a small hole in the side of the barn foundation, a place I had never noticed before, hidden under a pile of old hay bales. The hole was just big enough for a person to crawl through, and that's when I realized something horrifying. The barn had been used. Recently, someone had been living or hiding there, maybe watching me, maybe watching the farm for weeks, months. The thought made me physically sick. I spent the next morning clearing out the barn carefully, piece by piece. Old crates, rotting hay, broken tools. Then, beneath a pile of discarded sacks, I found a tattered sleeping bag, a small pile of canned food, and a few empty bottles. It was enough to confirm my suspicion. Someone had been living there unnoticed and likely observing every move I made. The person wasn't there now, but the knowledge left a gnawing fear in my chest. I called my uncle that afternoon. He didn't seem surprised. Apparently, a few years back, a man had been squatting on the farm for months before disappearing when the owners returned. No one ever knew where he went. He warned me to stay alert, never leave the cabin alone at night, and to always keep the doors locked. I didn't argue. The rest of the summer passed slowly. I stayed on edge constantly, double-checking locks, scanning the tree lines every time I went outside, and never venturing far from the main farm. I never saw the squatter again, though sometimes, late at night, I would hear the soft, dragging footsteps in the mud outside. Sometimes I would find tools slightly moved from where I left them, small reminders that someone or something had been here and could come back. By the time fall arrived, I was ready to leave. The farm had taught me more than just how to feed animals and mend fences. It had taught me the raw, unnerving reality of isolation. That summer, the farm wasn't peaceful. It wasn't charming. It was a place where I understood how quickly the line between safety and danger could blur, where the silence of the fields could hide a watcher, and where a simple storm could reveal the fragility of solitude. I left Missouri with a heavy heart, but also a strange sense of relief. I had survived, and I had learned to trust my instincts, to notice the small things others might overlook. Even now, decades later, whenever I hear rain tapping against a window or footsteps on wet grass, I think of that cabin, the hidden barn, and the figure in the storm. And though the fear has faded, the memory remains as vivid as the first time I saw those prints in the mud. I was 34 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a rented cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was late September of 2019, the time of year when the mornings felt sharp and cold, and the sky turned dark earlier than it should. I had been working long hours at a factory job and felt worn down by noise, lights, and people. I told myself a quiet place far from everything would help me reset. The cabin sat on a thin strip of land between a lake and a long stretch of dense trees. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and the owner told me the cabin didn't get many visitors that time of year. That didn't bother me. I thought I wanted silence. When I arrived, the place looked older than the photos online. The logs were dark and weathered, the porch leaned a little on one side, and the windows had a slight fog inside the glass as if moisture had been trapped for years. Still, it felt solid enough, and the view of the lake made up for everything. The water was calm and cold-looking, with thin layers of fog drifting over it in the early light. I unpacked slowly, trying to let the quiet settle in. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the slow push of water against the shore. The first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch until the sky turned black, listening to the woods. It amazed me how loud nature became when there were no cars or voices around. I heard branches crack, owls call out, and small animals move through the brush. I slept early, wrapped in heavy blankets because the temperature inside the cabin dropped fast after sunset. I didn't feel scared then, only isolated. In a way, it felt good. The second night changed everything. It had rained all afternoon, leaving the ground wet and the air heavy. Around 9 o'clock, I stepped outside to bring in some firewood. The yard was dark except for the thin beam of the porch light. When I walked down the steps, my boots sank slightly into the soft mud. I bent down to grab a piece of wood, and that was when I felt something, just a faint tug in my chest, the strange instinct of being watched. I looked toward the tree line, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. At first I told myself it was nothing, just shadows shifting. But then I saw her. She stood between two thick trees, barely visible, almost like she was part of the darkness. She wasn't moving. She was just there, a shape at first, but the longer I looked, the more I could make out. It was a woman, thin, with long dark hair hanging straight down. Her clothes looked wrong for the weather, light, loose fabric that clung to her arms. She didn't step forward. She didn't turn. She didn't do anything. She only stood there, facing me, like she had been waiting for me to look up. My mind tried to find a normal explanation. Maybe she was lost. Maybe there was a campsite nearby I didn't know about. But something in the way she stood, motionless, rainwater dripping from her hair and clothes, made every part of me tighten. I felt exposed out in the open, so I backed toward the porch without turning around. I kept my eyes on her the whole time. When I reached the top step, the woman shifted. Not a full step, just the slightest lean forward, like she was adjusting her weight. It was enough. I went inside and locked the door with shaking hands. I barely slept that night. Every small noise outside felt sharp and threatening. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to make sense of why she was there and why she didn't move or call out. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted but relieved. I stepped outside again, half expecting to see footprints in the mud leading to the trees. But the ground was messy from the rain, and I couldn't tell if anything had been there or not. I tried convincing myself I was tired and maybe misread what I saw. But on the third day, things got worse. I spent the morning walking along the lake to clear my thoughts. The air smelled like wet leaves, and the cold bit into my fingers. When I returned, I noticed something on the porch that hadn't been there before. Mud. Thin, narrow streaks of it smeared across the wood, almost like someone had dragged their fingers through the wet dirt and wiped them slowly along the boards. The streaks led to the door and stopped right beside it. I felt a heavy pressure in my chest, the kind that comes when you know something is wrong but can't admit it out loud. I didn't know if she had come up to the porch while I slept or while I was gone. Both possibilities felt equally disturbing. I spent the next hours inside, walking from window to window, checking the yard. The trees walled in the cabin on three sides, and every so often I thought I saw a shape move between them. I couldn't tell if it was her or my imagination feeding on fear. As the sun lowered, the air grew colder. The light fading through the trees cast long shadows that shifted across the ground like slow-moving arms. I tried reading to distract myself, but I kept glancing at the windows. At some point, while the last of daylight hung above the lake, I noticed something else. The woman was back. She stood in the same place as before, in the same position, facing the cabin. Even from a distance, something about her posture felt unnatural. Too straight, too still. Her arms hung down, thin and pale, and her hair looked almost black against the trees. I stared at her for a long time, frozen. The world around me seemed to shrink until it was just me, the cabin, and the woman in the woods. I stayed inside that night, not daring to go near the door or windows. I pushed the small table against the door even though I knew it wouldn't stop much. My heart pounded every time I heard the wind or the creaking of the old wood. Hours passed, slow and heavy. At one point, near midnight, I heard something outside. Not footsteps, more like a soft brushing, as if someone ran their hand lightly along the wall. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other in a slow, dragging line. I stood in the middle of the room holding my breath, listening to it circle me. I stayed awake until the first light of morning bled into the room. The sound stopped long before that, but I didn't move. When I finally stepped outside, the air was cold and sharp. I walked slowly around the cabin. On the far side, I saw more mud on the wall, smeared in long strokes about the height of a person's hand. My stomach turned as I ran my fingers over the marks. They weren't random, they were deliberate. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed fast, shoving everything into bags without folding or organizing. My body felt tight, shaky, ready to run. Before leaving, I walked to the spot in the trees where she had been standing those nights. The ground was packed tighter than the rest, the leaves flattened and disturbed like someone had stood there many times, for long periods, in the exact same place. I felt a cold rush through me. I looked around the woods, half expecting her to be watching from behind one of the trees. I didn't see her, but the silence felt thick and wrong, as if the whole forest held its breath. I drove away without looking back. The road twisted through miles of trees before reaching any sign of town. Only when I saw the first highway sign did I finally feel a little safer. Weeks later, even in my apartment with people nearby and lights outside the window, the memory of that woman stayed with me. I never learned who she was or why she stood outside that cabin. I didn't report it. I didn't go back. But sometimes, on cold nights, I still think about those long streaks of mud on the walls, the silent figure watching from the trees, and the slow, dragging sound of a hand moving around the cabin while I stood alone inside. I had gone there to find quiet, but what I found instead was something I still can't explain. Something real, something human, something that wanted to be close. And the scariest part was knowing she wasn't a ghost or a legend or anything supernatural. She was a real woman, standing out there in the cold, in the dark, watching me for hours, maybe days. And the truth is, knowing she was real made it much worse. It was the summer of 2012 when I first stumbled across the cabin. I was 23 at the time, backpacking alone through the mountains of northern Vermont. I had always been drawn to the kind of quiet that comes with being deep in the woods, where the air tastes sharp with pine and the only sounds are the wind and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. My plan was simple: hike the long trail for a week, camp out under the stars, and take photographs. But what I found on the fourth day of my hike was something I hadn't expected. A cabin that time had forgotten. I had been following a narrow deer trail that branched off from the main path. The trail was overgrown, tangled with ferns and low-hanging branches, and it had taken longer than I expected to reach the small clearing where the cabin stood. At first glance, it seemed almost picturesque. A small structure made of rough, gray wood, with a pitched roof sagging in the middle and a chimney leaning slightly to one side. Windows were cracked, their glass opaque with years of dirt and grime. Moss clung to the sides like stubborn green hair, and a small, collapsed porch extended out over the front entrance. For a brief moment, I felt a rush of excitement, thinking of the photographs I could take. I was drawn to places like this, places where nature had begun reclaiming the remnants of human life. The closer I got, the more I noticed the small details that made the cabin feel wrong. The front door was hanging on one hinge, tilting at an odd angle. The smell hit me first, a combination of damp wood, rot, and something else I couldn't identify. It was faint, but it carried the unmistakable weight of neglect. As I stepped onto the porch, I could feel the wood creaking beneath my weight, threatening to give way. I had to step carefully, balancing my pack as I made my way to the doorway. Inside, the cabin was dim, the only light coming from the cracked windows. Dust coated every surface in a thick layer, disturbed only by the occasional animal footprint pressed into it. There was a table in the center, knocked over, its legs splintered. The floorboards sagged ominously, and I had to step lightly to avoid breaking through. Against one wall, I saw a rusted stove, blackened with soot, and in the corner, an old metal bed frame with nothing but a torn mattress. It was clear no one had lived here for decades, but the cabin wasn't empty in the way an abandoned house often is. There was a sense that it had been left in a hurry, that someone had just walked away. On the stove, a cast iron pot sat, its lid slightly askew. I swear I could feel the residue of a fire long dead, the faint memory of warmth lingering in the cold air. I moved slowly through the cabin, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. My flashlight caught on something on the wall near the far end of the room. Nails and hooks, some holding scraps of frayed rope. My stomach turned a little as I realized some of the rope was still tied in knots, the kind that didn't come undone easily. Someone had been here and had done something. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was probably for practical purposes. Tying firewood, hanging tools. I wanted to explore more, but a sense of unease was creeping in, like static in the air before a storm. I decided to check the back of the cabin. A small door led to what must have been a storage area or a shed. The hinges groaned as I opened it, and a swarm of insects immediately took flight. Inside, I found a collection of old tools. Hammers, saws, axes, all rusted and worn. But what caught my eye was a wooden crate tucked in the corner. It was heavy and covered in dust, and when I tried to lift it, I realized it wasn't locked. I hesitated for a long moment, then pried the lid open. Inside were jars, old glass jars filled with something preserved. At first, I thought it was food, pickled vegetables, maybe, but the contents were dark, unrecognizable, and had a strange, oily residue. I closed the lid quickly, my heart racing. I didn't want to touch it again. I had never been particularly squeamish, but there was something about the cabin that made my skin crawl. By now, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing outside. I knew I needed to find a place to camp for the night, and as much as I wanted to leave, part of me was curious. I moved to the side of the cabin and discovered a small path that led down to a creek. The water was clear and cold, and I knelt to fill my bottle, listening to the sound of it rushing over rocks. That's when I heard it. A scraping noise, faint at first, coming from the cabin. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to listen. It stopped. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was the wind, the settling of old wood. But the hair on the back of my neck remained on edge. Night fell quickly in the mountains, faster than I expected. I built a small fire near the creek, close enough to see the cabin but far enough to feel safe. The fire crackled and popped, illuminating the clearing in a warm orange glow. I watched the cabin, taking in its crooked silhouette, the way the moonlight caught on the broken windows. And then I noticed it, the faint impression of footprints leading away from the cabin toward the woods. They were human, I could tell. Fresh, too, as if someone had walked this path earlier that day. My stomach dropped. I had been completely alone on this part of the trail. No other hikers, no one. And yet, there were prints. I debated whether to follow them, curiosity warring with fear. In the end, I decided against it. I stayed by my fire, keeping my backpack close, my knife within reach. The night stretched on. The forest was alive with sounds. Owls hooting, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But none of it was unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, that the cabin itself was waiting, patient and silent. When dawn finally came, I packed my things quickly. I took one last look at the cabin from the clearing. In the morning light, it looked almost peaceful, like any old, forgotten building, but I knew what I had felt inside. There was history there, a story etched into the walls that I would never fully understand. I left the clearing and returned to the main trail, glancing back only once before the trees swallowed the cabin from view. Years later, I told myself I would go back, maybe with proper equipment, maybe to investigate properly. But something always held me back. The thought of that cabin, the weight of the stillness inside, the jarred feeling of footsteps and rope and the things I didn't understand. I never returned, and part of me is okay with that. Some places aren't meant to be solved, aren't meant to be understood. Some places are simply meant to remind you that the world is bigger, older, and stranger than you can ever know. and that sometimes the right choice is simply to walk away. I never found another cabin like it. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I think I see its shape through the trees, just for a second, and I feel the same chill I felt that night. But the path I took away from it, the path that led me back to safety, back to warmth, back to my own life, is the one that mattered. I survived, and I carried that story with me, knowing that the world is full of hidden corners, places that hum with history, danger, and the quiet weight of time. And sometimes that is enough. It was the fall of 2016, and I had just turned 18. My dad had a friend named Rick, a rugged, middle-aged man who had been close to our family for years. He wasn't a bad guy, but there was something about him that always felt uneasy, like a layer of roughness hiding something deeper. My dad had invited me to spend a weekend at Rick's cabin up in northern Minnesota, a place tucked deep into the pines, far away from any real town. I had never been that far north before, and the idea of being out in the woods without cell service or anyone around both excited and unnerved me. Rick's cabin was the kind of place you only heard about in stories. It sat on a small rise overlooking a frozen-over lake, the kind of lake that went still and silent in the cold, where you could hear your own heartbeat echoing in the emptiness. The cabin itself was old, built from rough-hewn logs and darkened by decades of smoke and rain. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dusty, yellowed with age. Inside, the air smelled like pine, mothballs, and something else I couldn't place, like damp earth mixed with old wood. Rick had been preparing for our trip for weeks, sending me instructions on what to pack, warning me about the cold nights, the black flies, the bear warnings posted around the trails. He drove us up in his old pickup truck, the tires crunching on the gravel road that led deeper into the forest with every mile. The further we went, the taller the pines grew, until the sunlight barely reached the dirt path. By the time we arrived, the sky was already a bruised orange, the kind that makes the world feel heavy and quiet. The first night was normal enough. Rick had a wood-burning stove in the cabin, and he chopped enough firewood to last the weekend. We ate canned chili out of metal bowls and drank lukewarm coffee from chipped mugs. The wind rattled the windows, and the trees groaned like old bones, but there was comfort in the routine of it. I kept noticing little things, like the way Rick's eyes always darted to the edge of the tree line when he thought I wasn't looking, or how he would stop mid-chop of wood if he heard a noise outside, listening intently even though there was nothing there. I chalked it up to him being used to the woods. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. The cabin was colder than it should have been, despite the fire. Rick had gone out earlier to check some traps he set near the lake, leaving me alone with the silence. I was reading an old paperback I had brought along, but the words blurred as I tried to focus. That's when I heard it. A thump outside, like something heavy falling against the side of the cabin. I froze, telling myself it was just a branch or maybe a raccoon. Then another thump, this time from the back of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I thought about calling Rick, but my phone had no service, just a tiny flashing icon in the corner that taunted me with its uselessness. I grabbed the small flashlight I had brought and tiptoed to the window, peeking out into the darkness. The trees were thick, and the shadows twisted in the weak light of the moon. Nothing moved, but the air seemed heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I went back to the fire, trying to calm myself. That's when I noticed the door, the main door to the cabin, the one with the rusty latch Rick always kept secured, was slightly ajar. My heart pounded, and my hands trembled. I was sure I had closed it before, but maybe I was mistaken. I eased it shut and locked it, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever was out there had to be someone strong. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. By the time Rick returned, the sun was just beginning to rise, washing the forest in pale yellow light. I didn't mention the door. Couldn't. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Rick noticed my quietness and gave me a half smile, the kind that made me uneasy because it didn't reach his eyes. The next day, we went for a walk along the lake. The snow was just starting to melt, leaving patches of wet, muddy ground. Rick carried a small hunting rifle, not for me, just in case, he said. We moved slowly, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling that same weight pressing down on my chest. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were large, booted footprints, pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin in a rough, irregular pattern. My throat went dry. I pointed them out to Rick, who studied them for a long moment, frowning. He didn't say anything at first, just knelt down and traced a finger along one of the prints. Then he stood up slowly, scanning the treeline. "Someone's been here," he said finally. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge I hadn't heard before. "Stayed out there last night, probably watched the cabin. Didn't come inside, though." I felt a wave of relief mixed with terror. They hadn't come inside, but they had been close enough to see us, maybe even hear us. Rick didn't suggest we leave. He didn't even seem particularly worried, which was worse. It made me realize how little control we had out there, deep in the woods, with no one to call and no way to escape quickly. That night, I stayed awake by the fire, listening. The thumping came again, softer this time, like someone testing the cabin, moving around the edges. I kept the rifle near my bed, trying to convince myself it would be enough. Hours passed. The wind howled outside, and shadows shifted in ways that didn't make sense. I didn't sleep. By morning, the footprints were gone. Nothing remained except for the mud and the faint disturbance of pine needles. Rick brewed coffee, and we ate breakfast in silence. I wanted to ask what we were going to do, but I didn't. Something in Rick's calm demeanor suggested he had been through worse, and that arguing wouldn't change anything. We spent the next day hiking deeper into the forest, pretending to enjoy the solitude, but I was hyper-aware of every snap of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth. By late afternoon, we returned to the cabin to find a new sign that made my blood run cold. A single boot print, larger than any man's foot, pressed clearly into the snow near the porch. It wasn't there before. Someone had circled back while we were gone. Rick finally spoke, telling me we weren't going to stay another night. He packed his truck in record time, double-checking the locks and scanning the treeline like a predator himself. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin. The sun had dropped behind the pines, casting long, dark shadows across the snow. I thought I saw movement, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, just watching us leave. When we reached the highway, cell service returned. I called my dad, hands shaking, voice trembling. Rick drove on silently, focused. My dad's voice on the other end was calm, but I knew he could hear the fear in me. We never spoke about it again, and I never went back to the cabin. But even years later, whenever I think about that weekend, I feel the same tight, cold weight in my chest. The memory of being watched, the feeling of being completely exposed, lingers. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't some storybook horror. It was real, and that reality is far more terrifying than anything I could imagine. The woods can hide people, and sometimes those people aren't friendly. That weekend taught me that lesson in the starkest way possible, leaving me with a truth that I carry with me every time I enter a forest. Out there, you are never truly alone, and sometimes what you can't see is the most dangerous of all. It was the fall of 1998 when I first decided to take a solo trip into the remote woods of northern Maine. I had just turned 29, burned out from years of constant work at the printing press in Portland, and I craved silence the way some people crave air. I had heard about a small cabin on the outskirts of Baxter State Park, tucked far enough into the forest that cell reception was nearly impossible. The description in the old guidebook made it sound perfect. Rustic, isolated, and completely cut off from the world. I packed my old Jeep with the essentials: a sleeping bag, canned food, water, a small first aid kit, a few books, and my father's old hunting rifle, though I didn't expect to use it. I had done this kind of solo camping before, but there was something about this particular trip that felt heavier. Maybe it was the stories I had read about people getting lost or stranded in the woods, the warnings about harsh weather and deep snow. I ignored the knot in my stomach, thinking it was just nerves. The drive itself was uneventful, but long. I left Portland just before dawn and drove north, past rolling hills, dense pine forests, and small towns that felt like they hadn't changed in 50 years. By the time I reached the last gas station before the park, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. The attendant, an older man with a weathered face, gave me directions but warned me to stick to the marked trails and don't linger after dark. I nodded politely, though I barely registered his words. The dirt road to the cabin was rough. My Jeep rattled over loose stones and fallen branches. After nearly 3 hours, I spotted it. A small, weathered log cabin, its shingles darkened with age, smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. Around it, the forest seemed to swallow everything, thick pines pressing close on all sides. I parked, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and damp earth. Dust covered the corners, and cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams, but the cabin was intact, cozy in its own neglected way. I spent the first day exploring the immediate area, gathering firewood, and setting up my small stove. By nightfall, I had a fire going, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, then sat back, letting the silence sink in. It was a good kind of silence at first, the way the woods could feel alive without any human presence. But as darkness fell, it began to feel different, heavier. I remember the first sound clearly, the faint thump coming from outside. I froze, listening. The thump repeated, slow and deliberate, like someone stepping on dead branches. I told myself it was a deer, or perhaps a raccoon, and tried to ignore it. But as the night went on, the noises multiplied. Branches snapped underfoot, low rustles moved through the underbrush, and occasionally there was a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the wooden ceiling, the rifle across my lap. Every time I heard a new noise, my heart jumped. Hours passed. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of shadows moving through the cabin walls. Morning brought a false sense of relief. The forest looked calm again, bathed in gray light. I stepped outside, hoping the night sounds had been my imagination. But that's when I noticed it, tracks. Footprints, human, muddied and half covered in leaves, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. They were fresh, too fresh. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here last night, close enough to touch the cabin. I spent the next few hours walking around the perimeter, searching for signs of a campsite or other people. Nothing. No fire pits, no discarded trash, nothing except the footprints fading back into the trees. I told myself again to calm down. Maybe a hiker had passed by. Maybe it was nothing. By the second night, the sense of unease had settled into my bones. The noises returned, louder this time, accompanied by thuds against the cabin walls. My first instinct was to call for help, but the phone didn't work. I was completely alone, cut off, and entirely at the mercy of whoever or whatever was out there. I spent hours checking the locks, securing windows, and listening. The forest around me felt alive in a way I didn't like. Every shadow seemed to move with intention. I stayed awake the entire night, rifle in hand, barely daring to breathe. Dawn came slowly, and with it, a grim realization. I had to leave. Staying meant risking confrontation with someone dangerous. I packed quickly, grabbed my backpack, and headed for the Jeep. As I walked, I noticed the tracks again, now circling the cabin. Whoever had been out there was watching me. My stomach churned with fear, but I forced myself to keep moving. The drive out was tense. Every sound in the forest, every rustle of leaves, made me glance in the mirrors. I kept my eyes on the road, hands tight on the wheel, praying I wouldn't encounter whoever had been lurking. It felt like the forest itself was conspiring to trap me, with fallen branches blocking the path and mist settling low to obscure vision. By mid-afternoon, I reached the last paved road before the park entrance. Relief hit me like a wave. I stopped at a small diner, still shaking, and told the waitress I needed water and a warm meal. My hands trembled, and I avoided explaining why, because even saying it out loud made it feel more real. I was homeward bound after that, driving straight back to Portland without stopping. Weeks later, I reported the incident to the park rangers. They were polite but skeptical. They said there had been reports of trespassers and occasional campers who went off-trail, some with criminal records. They suggested I was lucky, that things could have gone far worse if the person had been armed or more aggressive. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. The way the forest felt like it was pressing in, the isolation that turned quiet into fear, and the sense that someone had been watching me unseen for hours. I keep a photo of the cabin on my fridge now, taken from the dirt road as I drove away. It looks peaceful in the picture, almost charming. But I know better. I know the truth. Isolation can hide danger, and sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost or a monster. It's a person. From that trip, I learned to respect the wilderness, to never assume I was alone, and to always carry more than I thought I needed. And though I haven't returned, every time I hear a branch snap outside my window, I can feel that same tight knot in my stomach, remembering the night in northern Maine when silence almost killed me.